This wasn't a football debate. It was a line being crossed, live, loud, and impossible to ignore. What started as another hot take in the endless sports media cycle suddenly turned into one of the most uncomfortable moments of the season. And it had nothing to do with arm strength, footwork, or draft boards. It had everything to do with who's allowed to be confident and who gets punished for it. When former NFL quarterback Shaun King stepped in to defend Shedeur Sanders and his father Deion Sanders, he wasn't just responding to criticism. He was responding to a narrative that's been quietly shaping quarterback careers for decades. A narrative that goes far beyond wins and losses. On the other side was Jason Whitlock, whose commentary didn't just question readiness or attitude. It used imagery and language that instantly set off alarms across the NFL world. What followed wasn't outrage for outrage's sake. It was a reckoning. Because this wasn't about whether Shedeur is perfect. It wasn't about pretending mistakes don't exist. It was about why confidence looks different depending on who's showing it. Why swagger gets praised as leadership for some quarterbacks, but framed as rebellion or a problem for others. The exchange exposed something deeper, how culture, race, and visibility still shape evaluation long before a young quarterback ever gets a fair shot on Sundays. And once that door was opened, it couldn't be closed. This moment went viral not because it was loud, but because it was familiar. Fans recognized the double standard instantly. Players felt it. And the league was forced, once again, to confront a question it keeps trying to dodge. Is the NFL actually judging quarterbacks on football? Or is it still uncomfortable with who gets to lead loudly and who's expected to stay quiet just to belong? Because that question isn't going away. The moment everything escalated wasn't a quote. It wasn't a stat. It was an image. When Jason Whitlock shared a graphic comparing Shedeur Sanders and Deion Sanders to Public Enemy, complete with prison bars and crosshair-style framing, the reaction was immediate and explosive. This wasn't subtle. This wasn't nuanced. It landed as something far more aggressive than football analysis. And that's why people froze. Because visuals don't just comment, they frame. They plant an idea in the viewer's mind before logic even kicks in. Prison imagery isn't neutral. Crosshairs aren't accidental. Those symbols carry weight, history, and implications that go way beyond sports debate. That's what made this moment different from every other hot take floating around the NFL media ecosystem. To many fans and analysts, this didn't feel like critique. It felt like branding, like an attempt to attach something dangerous, disruptive, or threatening to two figures whose biggest crime has been visibility, confidence, and success on their own terms. And here's the key part. This wasn't about intent. Even if Whitlock believed he was making a cultural point, the impact was undeniable. Once that image went out, the conversation was no longer about mechanics or maturity. It was about why those specific symbols were chosen and who they were being applied to. That's when the backlash grew teeth. Because people immediately noticed what wasn't there. No film breakdown, no scheme analysis, no on-field failure being highlighted. Just imagery loaded with meaning that's been historically weaponized against certain athletes far more than others. This is why so many said the line had been crossed. Criticism is part of sports. Harsh opinions come with the territory. But when commentary shifts from performance to symbolism, especially symbolism tied to criminality and fear, it stops being football conversation and starts becoming something else entirely. And that's exactly why this moment didn't blow over in a news cycle. It struck a nerve that had already been exposed. Because for a lot of fans, this wasn't shocking, it was familiar. They'd seen this framing before. They'd seen how fast narratives change when confidence doesn't come wrapped in silence. And that's why this image didn't just spark debate. It forced a response. And the response that followed would turn this from a viral moment into a full-blown confrontation, one that pulled back the curtain on how quarterbacks are really judged in today's NFL. The reason this moment didn't fade away is simple. Someone with real credibility stepped in. When Shaun King responded, it wasn't coming from a media personality chasing clicks. It came from someone who has lived inside NFL locker rooms, sat in quarterback meetings, and felt firsthand what it means to be evaluated beyond the stat sheet. That's what gave his words weight. King didn't yell, he didn't posture. He broke the situation down calmly, and that made it even more devastating. His point was clear. This wasn't tough love or sharp analysis. It was reckless framing. King called out the imagery for what it represented, not what it claimed to symbolize. Public Enemy wasn't about criminality. It was about resistance, exposure, and survival in systems that weren't built equally. Slapping prison bars and crosshairs onto that imagery wasn't commentary, it was provocation. And King made something else painfully obvious. You don't accidentally choose symbols like that. In sports media, words can be debated. Images are deliberate. They bypass nuance and go straight for emotion. King argued that once you introduce those visuals, you're no longer inviting discussion. You're assigning an identity. And when that identity is applied to a young quarterback who hasn't even taken an NFL snap yet, the consequences are real. That's why his response resonated. King wasn't saying Shedeur Sanders is flawless. He wasn't asking for immunity from criticism. He was demanding basic fairness. Judge performance on the field. Question decisions. Break down film. But don't drag cultural fear into a football conversation and pretend it's analysis. What made King's response even more powerful was his historical perspective. He reminded people that this kind of framing didn't start with Shedeur. It's been used before, subtly, then loudly, whenever certain quarterbacks refuse to shrink themselves to fit expectations. And that's where the conversation shifted. Because suddenly, this wasn't about one post or one commentator. It was about how easily football discourse slides into coded language when confidence doesn't look the way people expect it to. King gave voice to something many players and fans have felt but rarely see articulated clearly. That's why Whitlock's comments didn't just face pushback, they faced exposure. King forced the debate into the open. He stripped away the disguise of concern and replaced it with a harder question. If this was really about football, why did it need imagery like that at all? And once that question was asked, there was no going back. Because the response didn't end the argument. It escalated it. And what came next revealed just how deep this divide really goes. Instead of pulling back, Jason Whitlock doubled down. And this is where the debate truly cracked open. Whitlock's central claim was blunt. Quarterback success in the NFL requires submission. According to him, the position demands obedience to authority, suppression of individuality, and total alignment with coaching power. He framed hip-hop culture as the opposite of that, rebellious, loud, resistant, and argued that this cultural clash is why quarterbacks like Shedeur Sanders are destined to struggle. On the surface, it sounded like philosophy. In reality, it was a recycled narrative with new packaging. Whitlock leaned on selective statistics, pointing out that most of the quarterbacks with the best win-loss records this season are white. He presented that as evidence that submission works, while individuality doesn't. But the logic didn't hold up for long, because football doesn't exist in a vacuum, and quarterbacks don't succeed based on obedience alone. Context matters. Win-loss records are shaped by rosters, coaching stability, offensive lines, and organizational patience, factors that have nothing to do with music taste or cultural expression. Reducing success to submission ignores decades of evidence showing that leadership styles vary wildly among elite quarterbacks. And this is where the argument started to unravel. Because if submission were the true requirement, the league's most celebrated quarterbacks wouldn't be the ones known for confidence, emotion, and edge. They wouldn't challenge teammates, demand accountability, or bend systems around their strengths. Yet that's exactly what the modern NFL rewards. The bigger issue wasn't just the claim itself. It was who the claim was being applied to. Whitlock didn't argue that all quarterbacks must suppress individuality. He argued that certain quarterbacks do, and that distinction didn't go unnoticed. When confidence is reframed as defiance, and personality is treated as insubordination, it stops being about football IQ and starts becoming a cultural judgment. That's why Shaun King dismantled the argument so effectively. He didn't deny that quarterbacks must earn trust. He didn't deny that humility and work ethic matter. What he challenged was the idea that authenticity and leadership are mutually exclusive, or that culture determines coachability. Because if that were true, the league wouldn't look the way it does today. The NFL didn't evolve because it wanted to. It evolved because it had to. College football changed the pipeline. Quarterbacks arrived with new skill sets, new voices, and new identities, and the league adapted or got left behind. The submission argument wasn't analysis. It was nostalgia for a version of the NFL that no longer exists. And once that became clear, the conversation shifted again, this time towards something even harder to ignore: the double standard hiding in plain sight. This is where the conversation stopped being theoretical and started feeling undeniable. Because once the submission argument was laid out, people immediately noticed who it was being applied to and who it was. The league is full of confident quarterbacks, loud leaders, players with swagger, visible emotion, and strong personal brands, yet only some of them are labeled problems for it. That contrast is what lit the fuse. When certain quarterbacks celebrate, wear chains, show personality, or speak boldly, it's framed as leadership, competitive fire, alpha mentality, the traits of a franchise guy. But when the same behaviors come from someone like Shedeur, the language changes. Now it's about maturity, discipline, coachability, whether he'll fit. Same actions, different interpretations. And that's not speculation, it's pattern recognition. Fans pointed out how often black quarterbacks are asked to prove something extra before they're trusted, not just on the field but emotionally. Tone policing, body language analysis, constant reminders to humble themselves in ways others are never asked to. Confidence becomes something to be managed instead of celebrated. That's the double standard Shaun King kept circling back to. He wasn't arguing that criticism should disappear. He was arguing that the criteria keep shifting. That leadership is defined one way for some quarterbacks and completely differently for others. And once you see that pattern, it's hard to unsee. What makes this even more frustrating is that the NFL already moved past this in practice, just not always in conversation. The league markets personality. It sells swagger. It builds stars around individuality. But when that individuality doesn't fit an old comfort zone, the narrative suddenly hardens. That contradiction sits at the center of this entire debate. Because if personality were truly the problem, the modern NFL wouldn't function. The game is faster, more expressive, more connected to culture than ever before. Yet somehow, the discomfort only appears when confidence doesn't come in a familiar package. That's why this moment resonated so widely. It wasn't about defending one player. It was about calling out a system of evaluation that pretends to be objective while quietly moving the goalposts. A system where visibility is rewarded until it makes certain people uncomfortable. And once that was exposed, the debate couldn't stay contained. Because it forced a harder question. If leadership can look different, why are some quarterbacks still punished for showing it? And that question is exactly where this conversation was always headed. What makes this debate even harder to dismiss is that history completely contradicts the narrative being pushed. The idea that greatness at quarterback requires quiet obedience simply doesn't survive a serious look at the NFL's past. The league's most successful quarterbacks weren't molded by submission. They were driven by belief, ego, and an unshakable sense that they belonged long before anyone else agreed. Look at Tom Brady. He entered the league with a chip on his shoulder the size of a stadium. He wasn't celebrated for humility early on, he was mocked for his confidence. Too slow, too stiff, too average. His belief in himself was viewed as delusion until winning forced people to rewrite the story. Aaron Rodgers, labeled arrogant, difficult, aloof. Coaches questioned his attitude long before they praised his arm. That narrative didn't disappear, it flipped once success made it inconvenient. Even quarterbacks known for discipline and structure weren't immune. Peyton Manning was criticized for being robotic, predictable, and unable to win big games. Brett Favre was called reckless and careless, accused of playing backyard football at the professional level. Confidence has always made people uncomfortable until it's validated. That's the missing context in today's conversation. Now fast forward to the modern era. Quarterbacks like Patrick Mahomes and Lamar Jackson didn't succeed by shrinking themselves. They succeeded because teams adapted to who they were. Their creativity wasn't suppressed. Their individuality wasn't erased. It was built around. And that's the real lesson. The NFL doesn't reward submission. It rewards results. It tolerates confidence once it's paired with production. The problem is that some players are expected to prove themselves twice before being afforded the same grace. That's why the scrutiny surrounding Shedeur Sanders feels so familiar. He's being evaluated not just on throws and reads, but on how comfortable his confidence makes others feel, on whether his belief aligns with someone else's expectations. History shows how this usually plays out. Early confidence is called arrogance. Personality is framed as a distraction. Then success arrives, and suddenly those same traits are rebranded as leadership. The only variable is patience. And that's where this situation becomes critical. Because if teams and media refuse to learn from history, they don't just risk misjudging one quarterback. They risk repeating the same mistake they've made over and over again, mistaking discomfort for disqualification. And that realization leads straight into the most uncomfortable part of this entire conversation. This is where the conversation stops being theoretical and starts getting uncomfortable. Because when you strip away the buzzwords and talking points, what people are really reacting to isn't performance, it's permission. Who's allowed to lead loudly, and who's expected to earn silence before being taken seriously. The double standard shows up in the smallest details. When a white quarterback celebrates with emotion, it's called fire. Swagger becomes competitiveness. Confidence becomes command. But when a black quarterback shows the same traits, the language changes. Suddenly, it's about maturity, coachability, distractions. The evaluation quietly shifts from football to comfort level. That's exactly what Shaun King was calling out. He wasn't saying criticism is off limits. He wasn't arguing that Shedeur Sanders should be immune from accountability. He was pointing out that the margin for error is thinner, the patience shorter, and the labels harsher when confidence doesn't come packaged in a way that feels familiar to decision makers. And that matters because quarterback isn't just about talent, it's about trust. Trust from coaches, trust from front offices, trust from media narratives that shape public perception long before a player gets meaningful reps. Once doubt hardens into a storyline, it becomes harder to shake than bad tape. That's why imagery and framing are so powerful and dangerous. When criticism crosses into symbolism, when it starts invoking fear, rebellion, or criminality instead of performance, it does real damage. It doesn't just influence fans. It influences how organizations talk about players behind closed doors. It subtly reinforces old assumptions about what leadership is supposed to look like. And here's the part nobody likes to admit. The league already knows how this ends if handled wrong. We've seen talented quarterbacks lose years of development because teams tried to humble them instead of coaching them. We've seen players labeled problems before being given proper infrastructure. And we've seen franchises quietly move on, blaming the player while keeping the same broken process intact. That's why this moment resonated. It wasn't outrage for clicks, it was recognition. Fans saw a familiar pattern starting to form and reacted before it could calcify into another excuse, another wasted opportunity, another "what if" attached to a quarterback who never got the same runway as his peers. And once you see that pattern, you can't unsee it. Because the real issue isn't whether confidence belongs at quarterback. History already answered that. The real issue is why confidence still has to look a certain way to be accepted. And that leads directly to the final question this debate forces the NFL to confront, whether it's actually ready for the future it keeps promoting. This is the crossroads the league keeps pretending it, not standing at. Because this debate was never just about one quarterback, one commentator, or one viral clip. It was about whether the NFL is actually prepared to live up to the image it sells, modern, inclusive, forward-thinking, or whether it still defaults to old expectations when pressure hits. The league loves marketing evolution, faster offenses, creative playmakers, quarterbacks with personality and brand power. But evolution isn't real if it only applies when it feels comfortable. The moment confidence challenges tradition, the moment visibility doesn't ask permission, the system starts pushing back. That's what made this confrontation unavoidable. Shedeur Sanders hasn't failed at the professional level yet. He hasn't been given enough time to succeed or struggle in a meaningful way. And yet, the narratives are already being shaped, not around what he's done, but around who he is, how he speaks, and how visible he's willing to be. That's not evaluation, that's preconditioning. And the NFL has a long history with it. Every generation claims it's different, more open, more progressive, more objective. But every time a quarterback doesn't fit the old prototype, the same friction appears. Questions about humility, about submission, about whether confidence came too early, as if belief is only acceptable after permission is granted. The irony is brutal. Quarterback is the one position where belief is non-negotiable. You cannot survive it without conviction. You cannot lead grown men, handle failure, and command a huddle without an internal certainty that doesn't disappear under criticism. The league knows this. Coaches know this. Front offices know this. So when confidence becomes a red flag instead of a resource, something deeper is being exposed. That's why this moment mattered more than most fans initially realized. It forced the conversation into the open. It made people ask whether development is actually about coaching or about control, whether leadership is being measured or filtered, and whether the NFL is ready to evaluate quarterbacks as they are, not as versions that make everyone else feel safe. Because here's the truth the league doesn't like confronting. The future of quarterback play isn't quieter. It isn't less expressive. It isn't shrinking itself to fit a mold built decades ago. It's more visible, more confident, more connected to culture, and more demanding of authenticity. Teams that understand that will adapt and win. Teams that don't will keep blaming players while cycling through them, wondering why nothing changes. This moment didn't create that divide, it revealed it. And the way the league responds, silently, structurally, and over time, will say far more than any hot take ever could. Because progress in the NFL has never come from comfort. It's always come from moments exactly like this one. What made this moment so powerful wasn't volume. It was recognition. Fans didn't react because someone got offended. They reacted because they've seen this movie before, and they know how it usually ends. A young quarterback gets framed before he's fully evaluated. Confidence gets mistaken for defiance. Personality becomes a liability instead of a tool. And by the time the league realizes it overreacted, the damage is already done. That's why Shaun King stepping in mattered. Not because he claimed perfection for Shedeur Sanders, but because he demanded fairness. He forced the conversation back to football reality instead of coded narratives. He reminded people that development isn't about submission, it's about support, structure, and patience. This debate isn't asking the NFL to lower standards. It's asking the league to apply them evenly. Quarterbacks will always be judged. That's part of the job. Mistakes will be magnified. Confidence will be tested. But when criticism starts before opportunity, when identity overshadows evaluation, the system stops being competitive and starts being selective. And that's the line fans are no longer willing to ignore. The league is evolving whether critics like it or not. Quarterbacks are louder, more visible, more expressive, and more connected to culture than ever before. That doesn't weaken leadership, it reshapes it. The teams that thrive will be the ones that coach authenticity instead of fighting it. This moment didn't settle the debate, it escalated it. Because the real question still hangs in the air. Will the NFL judge the next generation of quarterbacks on how they play, or on how comfortable they make people feel? How that question gets answered won't just shape one career. It will shape the future of the position itself. And after this confrontation, one thing is clear. Silence isn't an option anymore.